Over the last few months, it's become pretty apparent that law enforcement seem to be focused on the Klein family possibly being connected to the Delphi double homicide case. And when you look at all the new information that's recently come to light, it's hard to not see why. There's just so many things that point directly at the Kleins that it's basically impossible to ignore at this point. The problem, however, is that I've yet to see a single compelling argument that points to just one of the Kleins in specific as the killer. Occam's razor says that the simplest answer is usually the right one, but ask yourself if a father-son internet catfishing potential murder duo is something that you would consider a simple answer. And while reality has no obligation to be simple or make sense to any of us, it's going to need to at least make some level of sense for a jury. And while it's not impossible for both Kleins to have been involved in the crime, it sure doesn't feel very likely. At least on the surface, it appears that either law enforcement don't have enough to actually charge Kegan, or they're trying to pressure him into turning state's evidence against his father, and that's why his trial keeps getting pushed back. But if that really is the case, what does that actually say about any potential evidence law enforcement could have that would support a conviction? Because I think in either scenario, the answer isn't a good one. In specific, I keep coming back to the idea of DNA that law enforcement have claimed to have for some time now, and why I believe that a partial or even a compromised DNA profile might be playing a very large role in this case.
Now, we talked exclusively to Superintendent of Indiana State Police Doug Carter tonight. He tells us that they have several pieces and parts, but they're still looking for that one piece of evidence or tip that's going to crack this case.
I know that we have the human element. We have a very solid science element. We're using every capable process that we have from a scientific perspective, as everyone would expect us to, and we will continue to do that until there's nothing left to do.
Would that include DNA?
It does.
Okay. Was DNA found at the scene?
It includes DNA.
For quite some time now, law enforcement has suggested that they were in possession of some form of DNA, and they've alluded that it was tied to the killer in some way. They even went so far as to request DNA samples from suspects who came up in the crime, including taking DNA from Paul Etter after his death.
Police are looking into whether a rape suspect who killed himself is responsible for the deaths of 2 Indiana girls. Paul Etter committed suicide last month during a standoff in Boone County, Indiana. Investigators are requesting DNA testing. Police had received tips about Etter in their investigation into the murders of Libby German and Abby Williams. The girls were killed more than 2 years ago while on a hiking trail in Delphi, Indiana. In April, police released an updated sketch of the suspect along with a short video from Libby's cell phone showing a man walking across an abandoned railroad bridge near them.
Now, I've read online arguments and leaks about the case that suggest the DNA sample that they have is basically a partial profile with only a few genetic markers, and it's kind of unusable, and that the whole idea of requesting DNA from suspects was mostly just for police to gauge the reaction of those that it had been requested from. But if that really was the case, then why take samples from Paul Etter after his death? It's pretty difficult to gauge the reaction of a dead guy, so I feel the most likely argument is that law enforcement do in fact have some sort of DNA, and while it might be degraded, it's still enough to at least draw comparisons with.
Tonight, the lead detective on the Delphi case tells me although the killer thinks that he got away, every single day lab techs are working to process evidence, including DNA that was left at the crime scene.
It takes a lot of times, and we want to be very thorough, so we want to take our time, make sure our I's are dotted, T's are crossed. But it's a tough case.
A case Indiana State Police First Sergeant Jerry Holman has worked every day for the past 6 months.
We're getting closer every day. I know that's cliche, but we are.
Dozens of state, local, and federal agencies still working around the clock to track down the man they believe killed Abby Williams and Libby German while the girls were out on a walk on the Delphi historic trails in February.
We're stronger than ever.
Police tell me they've conducted hundreds of interviews, followed up on thousands of leads, and served dozens of search warrants to find clues the killer may have left behind. Was there DNA evidence found at the scene of the crime?
I think at every crime scene you have, you're going to have DNA. We're still working on identifying whose all DNA we have there.
At first I thought the DNA might have actually come from a dog, Law enforcement seemed to be really interested in Chadwell, and there was a dog involved in his case, and shortly after the Anthony Shots account was announced to the public, Kegan's dog was actually removed from his home, so I made a video where I suggested that maybe the DNA was cross-transferred from a dog living in the killer's home.
I don't want to draw any false conclusions here, but as I'm reading about Kegan Klein, I want to understand the timing of the police's release of this information and the plea to the public based on what we already know about him. We've got his mugshot out there. We know that less than 2 weeks after the girls were killed, they searched his home. There was some indication that they had sparked an interest in this individual. Now we understand that he's got a pretrial hearing. They searched his home recently, and they took his dog.
But after reading the police interrogation with Kegan, I think it's most likely that the dog was removed because the type of images they found on his phone seemed to be related to illicit acts with animals. So I don't really think it's a stretch that law enforcement removed the dog as a result of that. That, and I think the act of removing the dog might have been one of the many things that law enforcement have done to mount pressure on the Klein family.
Just 11 days after the murders of Abby and Libby, task force investigators served a search warrant on the home that Kegan shared with his dad. At the time, the FBI told the Lafayette Journal and Courier they found nothing to indicate a connection to the Delphi case. Kegan's electronics were confiscated then, but he wasn't arrested until 3 years later. He's now facing 30 counts of child pornography and child solicitation in Miami County, Indiana, unrelated to the Delphi murders. He says, though, that Indiana State Police told him Anthony Shots had been communicating with Libby before her murder.
So why do you think investigators are putting so much focus on you right now?
I have not a clue. I think it's because they said I was the last person to talk to her.
So if law enforcement are in possession of some form of DNA, and it's most likely not dog hair, then what are we missing? Because if it was the killers and it matched either of the Kleins, I feel pretty confident that we would have had an arrest a long time ago. But ironically, I think Kegan might have actually spelled out what's going on for all of us during his interview with HLN.
I feel like I'm being harassed completely.
Did you have anything to do with the murders of Abby or Libby?
Not at all, and I've gave up my DNA, a hair follicle test. I've done everything they wanted me to.
Collecting hair is not how modern DNA samples are taken from suspects. Everything I've read says that samples are almost exclusively collected from mouth swabs. So taking a hair sample from Kegan doesn't really add up, unless, of course, they weren't trying to compare the DNA from the hair, but they were actually trying to compare the hair itself.
Hi, I'm Heidi Hessrick, biomedical lab science teacher, and today I'm going to walk you through the hair comparison analysis through Word Science. As you can see, there are 8 different samples of hair. We have the hair from the scene, and then we have 7 other possible matches. And you just want to decide which one you're going to start with. I'm going to pick the scene to begin with. The final hair from the scene is Taylor Diaz's, and I picked this little area because I thought it was cool where you can actually see that the hair has broken. Not necessarily relevant to solving the case, but still kind of interesting. And then if we go into the 10x and we get 100 times magnification, you can see the dark pigmentation of this hair. Go ahead and pause and sketch. You should now have great sketches of each of the 8 scene samples, noting the thickness of the hair, the coloration, presence or absence of medulla, whether the medulla is continuous or whether it's broken up. And from that, you should be able to tell whose hair was at the crime scene and match your samples.
If law enforcement have a hair that they suspect came from the killer, and that hair was, say, missing its root, then there's a very real chance that they would only have a very small or a partial profile, just like it's been rumored online for years. And to make things even worse, if that profile was small enough, I think there's a real argument to be made that it might very well be compatible with both members of the Klein family. And if that's not bad enough, Liberty German was said to have had a sleepover at a girl's home prior to the murders, a home that Kegan Klein had visited in the past. And although it's a stretch, it's most certainly something that would be brought up in court to explain away a stray hair as cross-transfer.
Now, this is something that's gained a lot of research, and particularly with forensic science, and it's the topic surrounding secondary DNA transfer. And what the kind of image shows here is two people shaking hands, and we can see that the DNA was transferred from the yellow person to the red person here, and now they each have each other's DNA. So to what extent can this actually happen on potential evidence? That's what this kind of looks at here. So first off, how did DNA get there? So advancements in DNA testing are overall fantastic. It's important to be aware of all the limitations in terms of determining how the trace DNA arrived at the location and how long it may have been there. This includes things like door handles and elevators and keys. It cannot be assumed that if your DNA is located at a crime scene, you must have been present and you probably committed the crime. And that's a misnomer that a lot of people make. If you find your DNA, you're assumed to be there, you're assumed to have committed the crime. You have to get away from that. Investigators have to look at other evidence surrounding the case, both circumstantial and physical. Considerations must be given to the fact that the DNA could have arrived on the evidence incidentally, or it could have been transferred via a secondary transfer event.
Given what all of us know now, I can't help but feel like it's pretty odd that law enforcement have focused so hard on Tony when everything, at least on the surface, seems to point to Kegan. I mean, a different device logging into the Anthony Schatz account from the same home isn't exactly evidence I think any rational person would use to exclude Kegan, so why would they have a cop car parked in front of Tony's house for months and say the type of things that they did in the interviews and put this amount of pressure on him? But I think that the possible answer to this lies in Kegan's hair sample.
Noting the thickness of the hair, the coloration, presence or absence of medulla, whether the medulla is continuous or whether it's broken up. And from that, you should be able to tell whose hair was at the crime scene and match your samples.
Forensic scientists have used comparison microscopes to view known hair samples against unknown hair samples alongside one another to see if they share similar characteristics for years. And even though this is far from slam dunk evidence, it might be the reason law enforcement are seemingly more focused on Tony as opposed to his son, because perhaps the actual physical hair itself seems to match up better with Tony than it does with Kegan. Because a hair missing a root really would explain a lot. At the very least, it would explain why they still collected DNA from the public, because it might not have been able to prove someone committed the actual crime, but it could have been used to potentially exclude someone from it. And while a partial profile may have matched multiple members of the family, the physical hair itself could have been more consistent with a man who, at least to the public, seems much less likely to have been involved in the crime as opposed to his son.
I feel like I'm being harassed. Completely.
Did you have anything to do with the murders of Abby or Libby?
Not at all, and I've gave up my DNA, a hair follicle test. I've done everything they wanted me to.
Recently, a person on Reddit who had supposed inside information about the case stated that law enforcement hadn't filed charges against Tony Klein because they believe his defense would point the finger at Kegan. And I think even detractors can admit that at the very least, Kegan's involvement with the Anthony Schatz account would create all the reasonable doubt a defense lawyer could possibly ask for.
In Science in the Soul, I have a chapter on reasonable doubt, and it's about, of course, the phrase reasonable doubt comes up in courts of law, where juries are told that they must convict somebody, say, of murder, only if it's beyond reasonable doubt that they are guilty. And that sounds all very good. It should be beyond reasonable doubt. But when you think about the fact that I think about courtroom dramas, which are so popular on television, for example, and I suspect that this accurately portrays something like what goes on in real courtrooms, and I've certainly been on 3 juries myself. There is a note of suspense in the court when the jury comes back. Which way will they go? Will it be guilty or not guilty? And then if they say not guilty, certain people heave a great sigh of relief. If they say guilty, other people do. So there is a lot of doubt in the courtroom among people who've sat through the entire trial. The judge, for example, the lawyers, the audience, sat through the entire trial as the jury has. So if the jury comes in and brings in a verdict that is beyond reasonable doubt, everybody in the court should know that. If it's beyond reasonable doubt, there can be no doubt of which way the jury will jump. And yet, when the jury do give their verdict, you go, oh, how can that be if it's beyond reasonable doubt?
There is a real possibility that the majority of the evidence police have is already known by the public, and that's why they haven't released more about the case, because there's really not a lot left to release. And the little bit that they do have, they need to hold on to, because those few remaining details are all that would prevent them from wading in an ocean of false tips or confessions that would be nearly impossible to rule out at that point.
Imagine the following experiment. Suppose that you had two juries listening to the same evidence, and the two juries not allowed to talk to each other. They're sent off into separate jury rooms, and they come up with their own separate verdicts. Who would bet on the juries coming back with the same verdict every single time? Virtually nobody would. If you think about the O.J. Simpson trial, for example, would anybody bet on another jury coming up with the same verdict? And yet, unless you can bet, unless you can say, yes, they would come up with the same verdict, you cannot really take the phrase beyond reasonable doubt seriously. Now, I'm not suggesting that we should have two juries in every trial. I'm just pointing out that the phrase beyond reasonable doubt doesn't actually mean what it says.
In the end, things definitely do feel like they've been ramping up towards something. Law enforcement have seemed to be getting as much information about the Anthony Schatz account as possible, because I think there is a very real chance that charges will be filed soon. But if law enforcement had a case that they were truly confident in, then there would have already been charges, and I can't help but feel like the majority of the evidence that they're working with might be circumstantial. And while it might be damning circumstantial evidence, any prosecution needs to be prepared for the mountain of reasonable doubt that's ready and waiting for them when they go to court.
Hi, this is Mike Haber. Thanks for asking me, can I be convicted with only circumstantial evidence? Yes. Well, that was another quick webisode. Look, in order for a police officer to arrest you for any crime, a cop needs to have probable cause. This means that a cop has to be convinced that there's at least enough facts and inferences available to make a reasonable person believe that there's a good probability that you committed a crime. And this can happen without any direct evidence at all, and based purely on circumstantial evidence. The same holds equally true for a conviction, meaning you can be convicted with no direct evidence at all and only circumstantial evidence. But the standard for a conviction is significantly higher than mere probable cause that's required for an arrest. In order to convict you, the state has to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that you committed the crime. Here's an example of a purely circumstantial case. There's a dead body. There's testimony that the deceased and I knew and disliked one another, that we had recently argued, and that I had made a verbal threat to kill him. There's also proof that I own a .357 Magnum and that the deceased was shot and killed by a .357 Magnum round. Someone says, although they did not witness the actual shooting, they did hear a gunshot, and within seconds, they saw someone matching my height and weight fleeing the scene. Further, my cell phone records confirm, at the time and date in question, my cell phone was in the area where the shooting occurred. Is this enough for an arrest? Absolutely. Any reasonable person could infer that this set of facts points to me as the shooter. I've got both the means and the motive. But is it enough to convict me? It could be, but that decision is going to be left to a jury, not to me.
Over the years, the public has grown accustomed to shows like Forensic Files, and CSI, and true crime dramas that more often than not paint a fairly inaccurate picture of how the criminal justice system works. And when the Delphi case eventually goes to court, and I believe it will, if the prosecution underestimates the power that the true crime genre and social media has had on public perception, I truly believe they're making a huge mistake, especially if the prosecution doesn't have rock-solid DNA evidence, and I think all signs point to that being the case. Because they're going to be dealing with a potential jury that has an unreasonably high expectation for evidence, and to make things even worse, there's a very real possibility that a juror may have been exposed to some of the absolute madness and conspiracy theories that's been all over social media surrounding this case. I can't help but think that it's going to be pretty difficult to find people in the state of Indiana who haven't at least on some level been potentially exposed to some of this on social media, which I can't help but think is pretty ironic. Given the fact that almost certainly these two kids' murders were set up as a direct result of social media, then it was used to terrorize their families for years and promote conspiracy theories and pseudoscience and baseless accusations. I just hope it doesn't come back to haunt this case all over again and lay the groundwork for unreasonable doubt that helps a killer walk free. And with that being said, thank you so much for watching.